Hello viewers, and welcome to another episode of Elections by Numbers. Today we are talking about the first state to ratify the U.S. Constitution and join the nation. I'm talking about the Blue Hen state, Delaware. Delaware is the second smallest state in the nation in terms of land area, and it enjoys faster internet speeds than any other state in the country. It's also the last state to get a national monument. As recently as 2013, the first state national monument was established. Consumers in the Blue Hen state also enjoy no sales tax, so Delaware is likely to get swamped during the holidays by out-of-state shoppers. It's also unique this year in the sense that it is the home state of the presumptive Democratic nominee, Joe Biden. Because Delaware is so small, it has one at-large congressional House district, meaning that it covers the entire state. The district has been in Democrats' hands since 2011, and the current incumbent, Lisa Blunt Rochester, has been representing the district and state since 2017. Blunt Rochester this year is running for a third term against an undetermined Republican opponent. It also should be noted that during the 2018 midterms, she won her seat for a second time with roughly 64% of the vote. Let's take a look at how raw House turnout has changed over the last decade in the state of Delaware. Let's bring up that graph right now. So as you can see from this double line graph, the state has had ups and downs, with those peaks occurring generally in presidential election years. We also see Democrats consistently outvoting Republicans in Delaware, which is the reason that it has been held by a Democrat for 10 years. What's also interesting to note is that the fall off from 2016 to 2018 in the Democratic column is barely noticeable. It's only slightly less than the turnout that the state had in 2016. Remember that 2018 was the year that incumbent Blunt Rochester won with 64% of the vote, so with a gap like that, she is a shoo-in for a third term. The question then becomes about those trend lines. If we project into 2020, is she likely to win again? And, well, yeah, she is. This is a seat that I consider to be safely in the Democratic column, as it has been for the last 10 years. So Blunt Rochester wins a third term. Let's make that official and put it on our first map. Mark it. And now it is time for us to focus our attention on the U.S. Senate election in 2020 for the state of Delaware. Incumbent Democratic Senator Chris Coons is running for a second full term. I use the words full term because his first electoral victory as senator in Delaware actually occurred in 2010 during a special election. The reason Delaware had a special election in 2010 was to fill the seat left by former Senator Joe Biden after he went off to be President Obama's vice president. So Coons won that special election in 2010 and then had a regular election in 2014 for a full term where he won with about 56% of the vote. What's also interesting to note is that even though he won 56% of the vote, he only won one of Delaware's 3 counties. Let's take a look at some voter ratios to see how Coons will fare this year. So looking at these numbers, we see that Democratic prospects in Delaware from a senator's perspective are less promising than they have been. During the 2012 senatorial elections in Delaware, the Democratic candidate enjoyed a voter turnout ratio of 106% versus the Republicans' 89%. What this means is that the Democratic senatorial candidate received 6% more votes than the Democratic House candidate running that year. It also means that the Republican senatorial candidate received about 10% fewer votes than the Republican House candidate running that year. Over time, though, we see that ratio for Democrats decreasing to a below 100% value, and the Republicans' ratio increasing to over 100% value. What this likely means for 2020 is that the Republican candidate will receive more votes than the Republican House candidate running this year. It also means that Coons might receive fewer votes than House candidate Blunt Rochester. Lastly, we have to look at Chris Coons' approval rating. He is, as of this video, enjoying a plus 24 net approval rating in the state, which more than makes up for his disadvantage in the voter turnout ratio numbers. So now let's look to Pollbot to calculate whether or not Chris Coons will win this seat again. Please, Pollbot. And there you have it. Chris Coons wins a second full term by approximately a 21% margin over his undetermined Republican opponent. Now we can make the results of the Delaware Senatorial election of 2020 official by putting it on our next map. Mark it. Delaware is having a very busy election season this year because they are also electing a governor in 2020. Incumbent Democratic Governor John Carney is eligible to run for a second term in the state, but he has, as of this video, not yet announced his intentions. So I'm going to do something a little different today. We're actually going to do two calculations. First, whether or not John Carney, the incumbent, can win a second term, and secondly, whether or not a generic Democrat can win a first term. Let's get into this and pull up some more voter turnout ratios. So here you see some pretty good numbers for Democratic governors running in the state. Over the last decade, we haven't seen that voter turnout ratio drop below 100%, and the opposite for Republicans, it's never gone above 100%. However, the trajectory of these numbers from 2012 to 2016 suggests that possibly in the future, Democratic candidates running for governor may experience a turnout ratio of below 100. And also those Republicans moving from about 87 to 97% means that they're likely on their way to being over 100% in 2020. So that's a little feather in the cap for Republicans running in the state. We also have to consider, though, John Carney's approval rating, which is very good. As of this video, he is enjoying a net positive approval of plus 27 points among Delawareans. So knowing that Democrats turn out in greater numbers for the House, and that this decade anyway, their voter turnout ratio for governors is better than that of Republicans, and John Carney has an incredible approval rating, let's determine whether or not we think he can win a second term. Poll bot. And there you have it, and there are no real surprises from this number. John Carney would win a second term by nearly 25% of votes. Remember though, he has not announced that he is running for a second term yet. I want to make a second calculation that takes out his approval rating as a factor. So in this number that Pollbot's about to cook up for us, it is only considering raw voter turnout coupled with voter turnout ratios. So let's go ahead and crunch those two numbers. Pollbot, would you mind? Oh, thank you so much. And there we have our second number, and it's still very good for Democrats in the state. A generic Democrat would beat a generic Republican still in the state of Delaware by about 21% of votes this year. This gubernatorial election in Delaware is one that I do not consider to be that competitive this year. So I think we can safely make these results official on our gubernatorial map, whether or not the incumbent runs. Mark it. And now it is time to talk about the presidential election of 2020, starring President Donald Trump and likely Democratic challenger Joe Biden. Even if folks know nothing else about Delaware's politics, they're likely to say that Joe Biden will have an edge in the race in this state because it is considered his home state. After all, prior to his tenure as vice president, he was a senator representing Delaware for 36 years. So the voters know him, and they know him well. Let's try to understand how Delawareans will vote for their former senator by looking at some more voter turnout ratios. So here we see some numbers that look a little bit less friendly for Democrats. During the 2012 presidential election, President Obama received only 97% of the votes that the Democratic House candidate received that year, whereas candidate Mitt Romney received nearly 127% of the votes that the Republican House candidate received that year. Looking ahead to 2016, though, we see a slight increase in that ratio for Democrats and a more extreme decrease in that for Republicans. The contrasting trajectory of these two figures suggests that maybe Democrats will have a better turnout ratio than Republicans this year, but that remains to be seen. We also have to consider the incumbent's approval rating in this race, and it is Donald Trump in this case. He is, as of this video, at a negative 10-point approval rating in the state of Delaware. Less than half of Delawareans approve of the job he is doing, whereas more than half of them disapprove. Can Donald Trump make up for this deficit with better turnout ratio numbers? Well, we turn to Pollbot to figure that out for us. Pollbot, would you calculate? And the answer to that question is very much no. Joe Biden is likely to carry his home state of Delaware by over 20% of votes. This comes as no surprise to me. As I mentioned, Delawareans know Biden, they know him well. They voted for him for nearly 40 years. So now let's make this result official on our presidential map. Mark it. So all the election results are in for the state of Delaware. Let's talk briefly about the political future of the state. Let's bring up an old line graph and a few new ones and get into this. So looking at the raw House turnout numbers that you were seeing earlier in the video, we see an advantage for Democrats going back at least for the last 10 years. I've also added trend lines for both the Democratic numbers and the Republican numbers. That is those dotted lines that you see in the graph. The Democrats are enjoying a slope value of 9, that is that value before the variable x. What this means is that Democrats in the state of Delaware, on average, every 2 years have increased voter turnout by 9,000 votes. When comparing this to the Republicans' slope value of 4.2, we can extrapolate that Democrats have been increasing their turnout by more than double that of Republicans over the last decade. Keep this data in the back of your mind while looking at these new trend lines that I've cooked up for you. First, let's look at these estimated slopes for the increase or decrease in senatorial to House turnout ratios. Looking here, we see some troubling news for Democrats running in the Senate in Delaware. Towards the beginning of the decade, Democratic candidates were enjoying an advantage in those turnout ratios, but the tides have turned in the years since, and now Republicans running in the Senate are getting better turnout ratios than their opponents. Remember though, these ratios are relative to the turnout for House candidates. So even though Republicans seem to be breaking away from the Democrats in this data, it still all depends on how voters turn out for the House. In the case of the estimates for gubernatorial to House turnout ratios, we also see to a lesser degree Republicans closing that gap slightly on Democrats. Whereas for presidential to House vote ratios, Republicans have on average been decreasing their voter turnout ratio, and the Democrats are closing that gap. Okay, let's throw all those graphs aside and I'll give you the short answer about Delaware's future. Delaware, formerly a swing state many years ago, is now a pretty reliable Democratic stronghold. I don't foresee a Republican winning any of the races that we've covered today for the next 10 years. According to the data I've collected, the most likely flip we're going to see is in the form of a Republican senatorial candidate, which might happen sometime in the 2030s, but that's too far away for me to predict. So Delaware, Democrats only for the next 10 years. And that just about does it for our most recent episode of Elections by Numbers. I want to thank you, the viewer, for tuning in today. If you like what you saw, please hit the subscribe button to get updates on new content as it becomes available. I upload videos every Monday and Thursday, and I'm also on Twitter, and I update that account with which state I'm going to be covering next ahead of the scheduled release date. So if you want to stay ahead of the curve, please follow me on Twitter, and that link is in the description. Thanks again for watching, and thank you for voting. See you next time.